crew mocked a black couple's budget tickets. Seconds later, the FAA inspector flashed his badge. "Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. As the couple entered the luxurious airport lounge, they didn't expect to be treated any differently than the other travelers. Dressed in modest clothes, no flashy jewelry, no designer bags, just a quiet confidence that said they belonged. But as they approached the check-in counter, the mood shifted. The glance from the attendant, cold and dismissive, was the first sign something wasn't right. "This is first class, not economy," the attendant said, eyeing their budget tickets with clear disdain. The couple tried to brush it off, but it was only the beginning. Moments later, the subtle mockery escalated as another staff member sneered, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" What they didn't know was that this moment would be the last time anyone dared to question their right to be there. Seconds later, the situation would flip entirely. A figure stepped into the scene, calm and composed, but carrying an aura of authority that demanded immediate respect. He flashed a badge, an FAA inspector, and suddenly, the balance of power was about to shift. Stay tuned to find out how this innocent-looking couple would turn the tables on the airport staff in a way no one saw coming. The room fell silent as the FAA inspector strode toward the front desk. The staff froze. The couple, still holding their ground, exchanged knowing glances. They had been here before, feeling the sting of prejudice. But not today. Today, they wouldn't back down. The inspector's badge gleamed in the soft lighting, and his voice was steady as he addressed the airport staff. "I'll need an explanation for this," he said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The attendants, who moments ago had ridiculed the couple, now visibly shifted under the inspector's gaze. The once confident and mocking expressions vanished, replaced by nervous glances. The situation that had been on the verge of getting out of hand had now turned into an internal audit. The power dynamic was shifting in real time, and the once embarrassed couple was about to take control. As the FAA inspector continued, the employees realized they had just crossed a line that would cost them dearly. It only took seconds for the situation to change completely. The couple's simple, dignified stance had done what no words could: expose the employees' prejudice. The inspector spoke again, this time his tone much firmer. "You've made a serious mistake, and I'm going to ensure it's addressed immediately." The employees fumbled for words, but it was too late. The inspector had already called for backup, and soon, the airport's higher-ups would be involved. The couple stood tall. No longer just passengers, now they were witnesses to a breakdown of an unjust system. And the employees? They could feel the weight of their actions catching up to them. As the situation unraveled, the inspector quietly ordered a full investigation into the staff's treatment of passengers. It was a decision that would lead to consequences far beyond a simple apology. By the time the couple left the airport, the staff who had mocked them were no longer there. The system had been forced to reckon with its biases, and it was all because one couple dared to stand up. No screaming, no shouting, just a quiet, powerful resistance that spoke volumes. The inspector's quiet authority had sparked a chain reaction, and justice had been served. In the end, what the couple proved was simple. Sometimes the most powerful way to fight back is not with anger, but with dignity and a willingness to expose the truth. Want to know what happened next? Keep watching. The repercussions for those who dared to mock a couple based on nothing more than their appearance will be unfolding before your eyes. What happens when a simple moment of bias gets caught on the wrong side of justice? Watch and find out. As the FAA inspector stood there, flashing his badge, the atmosphere in the airport lounge shifted instantly. The once confident and mocking employees faltered under the weight of his presence. The inspector's authority was undeniable, and the couple, who had been the subject of ridicule just moments ago, were now the silent recipients of an unspoken victory. The entire room felt the tension. It was as if the balance of power had suddenly been restored, but not without consequences. The couple stood tall, composed, no longer affected by the judgment that had been cast upon them just minutes before. They remained silent, their calm presence speaking volumes in a way that words never could. The staff, on the other hand, was visibly rattled, realizing that they had made a fatal error in judgment. The inspector didn't have to raise his voice, but his words carried the force of an unspoken command. "You will explain yourselves," he said, his tone cold, calculated, and unwavering. The employees, now forced to face the reality of their actions, were trapped in the very moment they had tried to manipulate. The inspector's eyes never left them as he stepped closer, forcing them to reckon with their own biases. "You've just violated every protocol that we stand for," he continued, his gaze cutting through the room like a blade. The room was silent except for the faint rustle of papers and the nervous shuffling of feet. The couple, still standing with quiet dignity, watched as the inspector called for backup, signaling that the situation had escalated beyond their control. As the tension in the room continued to build, the inspector's voice rang out again. "This will be handled by corporate, immediately." It was a statement that sent shockwaves through the employees. They were no longer in control of the situation. The inspector had already made his decision, and the repercussions for their actions would be swift. The couple, who had initially been dismissed and disrespected, now stood at the center of a storm of accountability. The power dynamics had shifted, and it was clear that no one was above scrutiny, no matter their position. The employees, once so confident in their authority, were now left to deal with the consequences of their actions. "You can't just treat people like this," the inspector muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The room seemed to exhale collectively, the realization of the gravity of the situation settling in. The employees knew that their actions would not go unpunished. Their arrogance had blinded them to the truth that their biases would be exposed, and justice would prevail. The couple, who had been reduced to mere objects of mockery, were now being treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. In the background, the first signs of change were already taking shape. As the inspector continued to gather information, the couple exchanged a brief glance. They didn't need to say anything. Their silence spoke louder than any words ever could. The moment was theirs. The truth had been revealed, and it was clear that the system would never be the same. The couple had won not through anger, but through resilience, poise, and an unshakable belief in justice. It was a victory that would echo far beyond the walls of that airport lounge. The FAA inspector stood tall, his presence now an undeniable force. The employees who had once been so confident in their power were now visibly shaken, their arrogance and mockery replaced with nervousness and regret. The inspector's words were clear, precise, and without room for argument. "You will all be held accountable for your actions," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of authority. The couple, still standing together, exchanged a glance, their faces unmarked by the chaos around them. They were no longer the victims of prejudice. They were witnesses to justice in motion. The inspector made a call, signaling that the higher-ups from corporate would be arriving soon to handle the situation. There was no turning back now. The employees, who had once humiliated this couple for their budget tickets, now stood on the receiving end of their own judgment. The inspector didn't need to say more. His presence alone was enough to unravel the control that the staff thought they had. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the room thickened, tension hung in the air, and the employees could feel the consequences of their actions closing in on them. It was clear that their biases had been exposed, and now, there was no escape. The corporate team would be arriving to address the incident, but the damage had already been done. The couple, still silent and dignified, stood apart from the chaos. They had endured the humiliation, but now they were witnesses to the unraveling of the very system that had tried to break them. The inspector's next words were spoken with finality. "Your actions have led to a breach of protocol, and corporate will be involved to ensure this does not happen again." The staff stood frozen, their faces betraying the guilt and fear that had settled in their chests. The inspector's phone buzzed, and with a swift glance, he acknowledged the confirmation of corporate involvement. There was no denying the seriousness of the situation now. The employees who had thought they could get away with their behavior were about to face the consequences of their actions. As the corporate representatives arrived, they were met with a room that had been charged with the weight of accountability. The couple, who had been humiliated moments before, now stood at the center of a reckoning. They had been right all along. Justice had been delayed, but it had arrived with undeniable force. As the corporate team began to address the employees, the couple quietly stepped aside. They didn't need to say a word. Their silence was the loudest statement of all. The truth had been exposed, and the power that had once belonged to the staff had been stripped away in an instant. As the scene unfolded, the couple remained calm and collected. They had come for a simple experience, but what they had received instead was an opportunity to make a lasting change. The employees, who had been so quick to judge, now found themselves facing a future that was uncertain. The moment of reckoning had come, and they were forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The corporate representatives arrived, their presence adding another layer of authority to the already tense situation. As they entered the lounge, their eyes scanned the room, immediately locking onto the group of employees who had caused the uproar. The once confident staff now stood in silence, their faces pale with the realization that they were on the verge of losing everything. The FAA inspector, who had been the catalyst for this moment, stepped aside as the corporate team took control, but not before casting one final glance at the employees. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. What had started as an innocuous moment of mockery and prejudice was now unfolding into a full-scale internal investigation, and the consequences would be swift. The couple, who had been the targets of this unfair treatment, watched quietly, their dignity still intact. They were no longer the subject of ridicule. They were the ones holding the power. As the corporate team began questioning the employees, the couple exchanged another look, a silent acknowledgement that this was their moment of victory. The employees were asked to step aside, and one by one, they were informed of the severity of their actions. The lounge, once filled with tension and judgment, now had a sense of calm. The silence that had settled over the room was thick, and the only sound was the steady clicking of keyboards as the corporate team began documenting the incident. The couple, standing on the periphery, were not the ones seeking retribution. They had already won, not by raising their voices or making a scene, but by maintaining their composure in the face of injustice. As the staff members were pulled aside for further questioning, the couple was invited to sit in a private room. They were offered apologies, though the couple did not need them. They had already made their point clear, without a single word spoken. The employees, now fully aware of the gravity of their actions, had been forced to confront their own biases and prejudices. They were no longer in control of the narrative. The truth had been exposed, and they were left to face the consequences of their choices. The FAA inspector, now in communication with corporate leadership, nodded as he received confirmation that the employees would be terminated. The couple, having witnessed the entire process, felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. It was not about the punishment. It was about the message that had been sent, a message that would reverberate long after the incident. As the staff members gathered their things, ready to be escorted out, the couple stood once more, unshaken and resolute. They had endured the slights, the mockery, and the discrimination, but now, they were the ones walking away victorious. The corporate team, now in full control, began to implement the necessary steps to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. The staff members were not just reprimanded, they were removed from their positions entirely. The couple, though they had no desire for public acknowledgement, knew that their actions had created a ripple effect that would be felt across the organization. It wasn't just about the specific incident, it was about changing the culture of the institution, about ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same treatment. As they left the lounge, the couple exchanged a final look, knowing that they had done something more important than winning. They had made a statement that would not soon be forgotten. As the couple walked out of the lounge, the tension that had once gripped the space seemed to dissipate. The employees, now left behind, stood in shock, their fates sealed. The corporate team had already begun their internal review, and it was clear that this moment would mark a turning point for the entire organization. The couple, having endured the humiliation and prejudice, now carried themselves with a quiet confidence, their heads held high. They had not only stood up for themselves, but had also challenged a deeply ingrained system of discrimination that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for far too long. The FAA inspector, who had played a pivotal role in shifting the balance of power, gave them a brief nod of approval as they passed him. His job here was done, but the real work was just beginning. The corporate leadership had already assured the couple that they would be taking swift action, and it was clear that no one, from the top to the bottom, would be spared from the consequences. As the couple entered the private room, they were offered more apologies, but they politely declined. It wasn't the apologies they sought, it was the change they had set in motion. The employees, who had been quick to judge and discriminate, now faced the very real possibility of losing their jobs, their reputations, and their careers. The couple knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger shift, one that would ripple throughout the company and beyond. The inspector, having witnessed the entire ordeal, now took a moment to reflect. This was not just another case of bias. It was a clear example of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. He made a mental note to follow up with the corporate leadership to ensure that real, lasting changes would take place. As the couple sat in the private room, they were approached by a senior executive who acknowledged their strength and composure throughout the entire incident. "You've changed the course of this company today," the executive said, "and for that, we are deeply grateful." The couple nodded but didn't speak. Their actions had already spoken for them. As the minutes passed, the corporate team worked swiftly, pulling the necessary reports and beginning the process of removing the staff members responsible for the discriminatory behavior. It wasn't just a matter of firing them. It was about holding them accountable for their actions and ensuring that the culture within the company would change. The couple, who had once been reduced to the status of a budget ticket traveler, had now become the agents of justice, forcing the company to confront its own biases. As they left the room, the couple exchanged a glance, a look that spoke volumes. They had not only survived the ordeal but had emerged stronger, their voices now louder than ever. The change they had sparked was just the beginning. They knew that the fight for equality was far from over, but today, they had made a significant stride toward creating a more just world, and that was something no one could take away from them. As the couple stepped out of the private room, the weight of the moment still hung in the air, but there was a sense of quiet triumph in their steps. The corporate team had already begun their extensive review, and the employees responsible for the discriminatory actions had been removed from their positions. The couple, having endured the humiliation, now felt a sense of relief that the power imbalance had been addressed in a way that was undeniable. They had not only won this battle, but they had also set a precedent that would resonate within the company for years to come. The FAA inspector, who had been a key figure in ensuring the integrity of the process, stood outside the room waiting for them. His job was done, but there was still more to be discussed. The couple exchanged a brief look of appreciation with him. His unwavering support had been instrumental in turning the tide. "It's done," the inspector said, nodding toward the corporate team, who were now thoroughly engaged in the aftermath. "But this isn't over," he added, his tone serious. "This is just the beginning of a much bigger conversation that needs to happen." The couple nodded in agreement, understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't simply about one incident, it was about addressing the systemic biases that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. The corporate leadership, recognizing the importance of this moment, had already pledged to overhaul their training and accountability measures, making sure that employees at every level were held to the same high standards. As the couple made their way toward the exit, they were approached by a few of the employees who had witnessed the events unfold. There was no confrontation, no resentment in their eyes, only respect. Some of them even gave quiet nods of acknowledgement. The couple's quiet strength had made an indelible mark on everyone who had seen what happened. The environment had shifted from one of hostility to one of reflection, and the seeds of change had been planted. "Thank you for showing us how to do the right thing," one of the employees said quietly, speaking up for the first time. The couple simply smiled, their eyes full of understanding. They didn't need to respond. Their actions had already spoken louder than words ever could. As they stepped out of the building, the couple realized that the ripple effects of what had just transpired would stretch far beyond that moment. They had ignited something larger than themselves, a movement that would force institutions to confront their biases and rethink how they treated people based on their appearance or background. For the couple, this wasn't about seeking accolades or recognition. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had. As the sun set over the city, They walked away not as victims of discrimination, but as champions of change. The world was starting to take notice, and their fight for justice was just getting started. As the couple left the building, the weight of the day began to sink in. They had walked into the airport lounge as just another pair of passengers, but now they were leaving as agents of change. The corporate representatives, still processing the incident, would soon be implementing new procedures, ensuring that the discriminatory actions they had witnessed would not be repeated. It had started as an uncomfortable moment of prejudice, but it had grown into something far more powerful, an undeniable shift in how people in positions of power viewed the world. The couple had not sought to be heroes, but in many ways, that is exactly what they had become. They had shown a quiet strength, refusing to be silenced or diminished. As they reached their car, they were approached by a few of the staff members who had witnessed everything, their faces full of remorse. One of the employees, a young woman who had been a bystander in the whole ordeal, stepped forward. "I just wanted to say, I never realized how deep this issue runs until today. You didn't deserve what happened. Thank you for standing up." The couple exchanged a brief but meaningful glance, their emotions still raw but tempered by the knowledge that change had begun. They simply nodded, offering a wordless acknowledgement. This was not about recognition. It was about making sure that no one else would face the same treatment they had. As the couple drove away, the sun setting on the horizon, the reality of what they had just experienced started to settle in. They had gone from being the victims of discrimination to the catalysts for change, in an institution that had long overlooked its own biases. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Their actions had spoken louder than any words could. The story of that day would not fade quickly. It would echo in the halls of the company, and far beyond, in the minds of those who had witnessed the injustice and those who would now take a stand against it. The couple knew that the fight for equality, for respect, and for justice was far from over. This was just one chapter, and they were ready to write the next one. They were determined to keep pushing forward, ensuring that the world they left behind would be a little bit better than the one they had entered. It wasn't about retribution. It was about creating lasting change. And they were just getting started. The following morning, the couple woke up to a world that felt subtly different. News of what had transpired the previous day had spread, and the ripple effect was already being felt across the company. The corporate leaders had initiated a full internal audit, and the employees who had been complicit in the discrimination were no longer part of the organization. The company was beginning to implement new training protocols, but the couple knew that these actions were just the start. Real change would take time. As they sat at breakfast, their phones buzzed continuously, filled with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers, all offering words of support. The respect they had earned in that brief but powerful moment had extended far beyond the airport lounge. But it wasn't the messages or the praise that gave them the most satisfaction. It was the knowledge that they had made an impact. The couple was now part of a larger conversation about systemic bias in the workplace, and they were determined to keep pushing for change. Later that day, the couple met with corporate executives to discuss the next steps. They weren't there to gloat, but to ensure that the commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity would remain at the forefront of the company's mission. "This isn't just about what happened yesterday," one of the executives said, acknowledging the couple's role. "It's about what happens next. You've forced us to confront something we should have been addressing long ago." The couple nodded in agreement, their goal never having been to tear the company down but to hold it accountable and make it stronger. They wanted the system to change not just for themselves, but for everyone who would walk through those doors after them. The meeting was a productive one, with tangible steps outlined for reform. The couple pushed for the creation of an internal task force dedicated to ongoing monitoring of staff behavior and ensuring that diversity and inclusion were not just buzzwords, but principles lived out every day. They also advocated for a program that would allow employees to report biases or mistreatment without fear of retaliation, ensuring that voices from all levels of the organization were heard and valued. As the meeting concluded, the couple felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that the process was already in motion. They had started something that could no longer be ignored. The corporate world was watching, and their actions would serve as a model for how to handle prejudice with integrity. As they left the building, The weight of the past few days hung heavy, but they both felt lighter. They had taken a stand, and now it was time to let the work speak for itself. They didn't need validation from anyone else. They had already proved what they were capable of. This was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would take them further than they had ever anticipated. They were determined to keep fighting, to keep challenging the systems that had once kept them down. It was no longer about proving their worth. It was about ensuring that no one else would ever have to face the same injustice. And in that moment, they realized that their fight had only just begun. Days passed, and the momentum from the previous events continued to build. The corporate team had made significant progress on the internal reforms, and it was clear that the company was working to make genuine changes in response to the couple's actions. But for the couple, the work was far from over. They were determined to make sure that their fight for justice would not be reduced to a single isolated incident. The emails, calls, and messages of support from employees across the organization kept coming in, some offering apologies, others expressing gratitude for sparking the conversation on inclusion. However, it was the quiet conversations in the hallways and the meetings behind closed doors that began to speak louder. The couple's influence was beginning to spread beyond the company. Industry leaders reached out to discuss their experiences and the ways in which they had dealt with discrimination, making it clear that their story had touched a nerve. The ripple effect was larger than they had anticipated, but they were ready to use it as a catalyst for broader change. They knew this would not be easy or quick. After all, systems of discrimination had been in place for decades, but what had started in an airport lounge was now a movement. The couple understood that real change would require sustained effort, so they continued pushing forward, meeting with more executives, making appearances at diversity events, and speaking to industry groups. They took their lessons from the airport incident and used them as a framework for conversations around race, equity, and inclusion in business. One afternoon, a call came in that would set the tone for what came next. A prominent advocacy group, focused on diversity in the corporate sector, wanted to partner with the couple on a nationwide campaign aimed at reshaping corporate cultures. The campaign would focus on dismantling systemic biases, providing training for businesses to ensure equity at all levels, and creating safe spaces for employees to report discrimination without fear of retaliation. The couple saw this as a perfect opportunity to take their message to the masses and began working closely with the group to develop the campaign. They wanted their story to be a beacon for others who had been overlooked, mistreated, or rejected because of their race. They wanted to build a world where no one had to face the same humiliation and bias that they had. A world where integrity and inclusion were the foundation of every organization. As the campaign began to take shape, the couple took a step back to reflect on everything that had happened. What had started as a small moment of prejudice had become something larger, something far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The couple looked at each other, their eyes filled with resolve and purpose. They had known that this fight was bigger than just themselves, but now they could see how far it could truly reach. This was only the beginning. The change they had sparked was undeniable, and they were ready to continue pushing forward, no matter the obstacles that stood in their way. The weeks that followed brought a whirlwind of activity for the couple, as they focused on the nationwide campaign that was now taking shape. They worked closely with the advocacy group, fine-tuning their message, organizing events, and preparing materials to reach corporate leaders across the country. It was a daunting task, but they were driven by the sense that their story was just the beginning of something much larger than themselves. They had become the faces of a movement, one that sought to break down the barriers that had long separated people of color from positions of power. Everywhere they went, they were met with praise, but also with skepticism. Some people questioned whether real change was possible, given how deeply ingrained the systems of discrimination were in corporate culture. Others were eager to learn more, to understand how they could take meaningful steps toward inclusion and equity. The couple knew they had to be both patient and persistent. As they traveled from city to city, meeting with business leaders, they made it clear that this was not just about diversity quotas or short-term initiatives. It was about creating lasting, systemic change, a shift in how people thought about and interacted with each other in the workplace. They talked about their own experiences, about the way they had been treated differently because of the color of their skin, and how that had fueled their determination to build something better. They spoke candidly about the challenges they faced as Black CEOs, not just in the corporate world but in everyday life. For every door that had been opened to them, there were countless others that had been shut simply because of who they were. But they also spoke of hope, of the belief that things could change if enough people were willing to fight for it. The campaign began to gain momentum. Corporate leaders were starting to take notice, and some even invited the couple to speak at their company-wide events. The message was resonating. Businesses were beginning to rethink their hiring practices, their leadership structures, and the way they treated their employees. It was a long road, but the couple knew they were on the right path. As the campaign spread across the nation, they saw firsthand the power of solidarity. Employees from all backgrounds were stepping up to support the cause, and communities were rallying behind them. The couple's story was no longer just about one moment of prejudice at an airport lounge. It had evolved into a powerful call for justice that was being heard loud and clear across the country. They had set out to make a difference, and now they could see the impact they were having. But even as they celebrated their successes, they knew that the work was far from over. The fight for equality, for real systemic change, was ongoing, and they were prepared to continue that fight for as long as it took. Months passed, and the couple continued their mission, now seeing the tangible results of their relentless work. The campaign for diversity, equity, and inclusion had transformed from an idea into a nationwide movement. Corporate leaders, once hesitant or complacent, were now actively seeking guidance on how to dismantle the systems of discrimination that had plagued their organizations for decades. But despite the progress, the couple knew they could not afford to become complacent. The momentum was undeniable, but change was still slow, and the barriers they had worked so hard to bring down were not completely gone. They had become frequent speakers at conferences, panels, and corporate workshops, sharing their experiences and encouraging others to do the hard work of creating an inclusive environment. The personal stories they told, stories of discrimination, rejection, and overcoming impossible odds, struck a chord with people across every industry. Their message was simple but powerful. True change requires commitment, humility, and accountability. Along with the advocacy group, they had now helped launch a new initiative that would provide resources to companies willing to go beyond just talk and take action. The initiative included a certification program for companies that met certain diversity and inclusion standards, offering them a badge of honor that showed they were genuinely committed to change. The first company to earn the certification was one that had previously been criticized for its lack of diversity and inclusion. The couple felt a deep sense of accomplishment as they watched company leaders proudly display their new certifications, knowing that the work they had put into the campaign was beginning to reshape entire industries. However, despite the wins, there were still moments of resistance. Some companies attempted to sidestep the deeper issues by implementing superficial diversity measures, things like hiring a few more employees from underrepresented groups or hosting a diversity workshop once a year. But the couple, and the broader movement, refused to let these actions be enough. They demanded true, long-lasting change. One day, the couple received a call from a major financial institution, one that had been at the center of the media's attention for its lack of diversity in its senior leadership. The company wanted to partner with the couple to address its internal issues. This was a breakthrough moment, a huge, recognizable company finally acknowledging the need for change. The couple agreed to meet with them, knowing that this was their opportunity to make an even greater impact. During the meeting, the couple pushed for systemic change within the organization, urging the company to look beyond just representation and toward policies that would ensure fairness in hiring, promotions, and pay. The discussion was long and difficult, but the couple knew that their persistence and their own leadership had already proven that change was possible. By the time they left the meeting, they had secured a commitment from the institution to overhaul its internal policies and to invest in long-term diversity initiatives. It was a victory, but it was clear that this fight for equality, for real transformation, was far from over. The couple, more determined than ever, continued their work, knowing that while they had achieved a great deal, there was still much left to be done. The battle had grown from one moment in an airport lounge to a sweeping movement that would shape the future of business for years to come. As the couple continued their work, the movement they had started began to take on a life of its own. What had once been a personal mission to fight against the prejudices they had faced had become a powerful force for change within the corporate world. The message of equity, inclusion, and fairness was being heard in boardrooms, conference halls, and offices across the country. However, the couple knew that this success was only part of the journey. They had built a foundation, but the work was far from over. Every victory they celebrated was tempered with the knowledge that systems of discrimination were deeply entrenched and would require ongoing effort to dismantle. They had become national figures in the fight for equality, and their influence had extended beyond just the corporate world. Universities, nonprofits, and grassroots organizations were reaching out, eager to learn from their experience and build upon the momentum they had created. The couple took every opportunity to share their story, reminding people that true change requires not just policy shifts but also a shift in mindset. It's not enough to check the boxes, they said in every speech and interview. We need to be actively creating an environment where everyone is truly seen, heard, and valued. As the couple traveled across the country, meeting with more companies and organizations, they saw firsthand how much work was still needed. They attended a major conference on diversity, where hundreds of business leaders gathered to discuss best practices for inclusion. The couple's keynote speech was met with a standing ovation, but the real work began in the days and months that followed. They received countless calls from companies asking for their help in implementing long-term strategies that would lead to measurable, sustainable change. One of the most powerful moments came when a tech giant, notorious for its lack of diversity and leadership, asked the couple to help them develop a comprehensive diversity strategy. The couple, fully aware of how critical this partnership could be, agreed to take the challenge head-on. In the months that followed, they worked tirelessly to craft a plan that would shift the company's approach from token diversity initiatives to systemic, lasting change. The work was exhausting, but the couple's resolve never wavered. Their belief in the cause, believing that every person, regardless of their background, deserved an equal opportunity, kept them going. Finally, the day came when the tech company made a public announcement that they had adopted a new, company-wide diversity and inclusion strategy. This was the culmination of years of hard work, collaboration, and a shared vision for a better future. The couple felt a profound sense of accomplishment, but they also knew that the road ahead was long. They were not done yet, and they would continue to fight until the systems of inequality were fully dismantled. As they reflected on their journey, they realized that the impact of their work had already exceeded their expectations. They had gone from being individuals marginalized by their own experiences to becoming catalysts for a movement that was changing the fabric of corporate America. And as they looked ahead, they knew their mission was clear: to ensure that every person, regardless of their background or identity, could walk into any room and know they belonged.